What I'm going to talk about today is actually, none of the things that you just heard about. It's really a very kind of like big picture kind of question that I think organizes a lot of the research that I do. So I think you're not going to hear a lot about specific research, but I think you'll hear more about a way of perhaps thinking about human cognition and how humans relate to artificial intelligence that I've found really generative in terms of coming up with interesting research ideas, and I hope it's something that you also find useful. So one of the classic questions that we ask in cognitive science is a question about what it is that makes human beings unique. And this is a classic question, not just in the sense of, something that goes back a few hundred years, but in fact, something that goes back, many thousands of years in the investigation of human nature. And if you go all the way back to ancient Greece, you find the sort of classic answer in the sense of the answer that was given by Aristotle. Aristotle thought that what makes humans unique is that, we're the animals that think, right? The animals that are capable of reason, and it's this capacity for reason that's the thing that makes human beings special. But Aristotle was thinking in a world where there was a particular kind of comparison class. He was looking at humans, he was looking at the rest of the natural world, and the implicit comparison class that he had was, of course, comparing humans to other biological creatures, to other animals. In our contemporary world, we have another comparison class that's very salient to us, and this is the comparison class of machines. And so when we ask this question in the context of this broader comparison class, as we start to think about, what human intelligence is in the context of a world where machines are becoming increasingly intelligent in specific kinds of ways, I think it's natural to feel a little anxiety and to ask, well, if we end up in a world where we have super intelligent machines, then what is it that makes human beings special? Is there anything that differentiates us? Is there any way that we might expect the human minds are different from the minds of machines? And what I'm going to argue today is that I think the answer to that question is that yes, there's likely to be an enduring difference, and that difference comes down to the nature of the kinds of computational problems that human minds have to solve. And so I'm going to claim that there's a distinct flavor of intelligence that's human intelligence, and that we're likely to see that distinct flavor of intelligence be something quite different from the kinds of intelligence that we see emerging from machines, even as we continue to develop the intelligence of those machines. And so this comes down to the fact that human computational problems, the computational problems that human minds have to solve, are things that are shaped by the limitations that are characteristic to being human, right? So when we think about the computational problems that humans face, often we sort of think about these in terms of like abstract problems that are things that any kind of intelligent system we might imagine has to solve, sort of optimization problems, problems of learning, and so on. But if we actually look more closely at the human case and the actual things that human beings have to do, the real computational problems that human minds have to solve are shaped by, I would say, three fundamental limitations. So the first of those limitations is the fact that we have limited time. And in the most basic sense, we have limited time on this earth, right? So human beings are mortal. We have limited amounts of time to experience the world and to develop the repertoire of actions, which is going to allow us to fulfill whatever goals we have. We have limited amounts of time to, make decisions, at smaller timescales, but we face fundamental constraints on the amount of time that we have to solve the problems that we face. The second limitation is that we have limited computation. So human beings are limited to the amount of computational resources that we can carry around inside our heads, right? A couple of pounds of neural tissue, that's it. That's all we've got. We've got to solve all of the problems that we're going to face, from putting a diaper on a baby, to driving a car, to composing music, to writing talks, to doing science. All of those things are done in this limited computational capacity. And so as a consequence of that, we need to be really good at making use of that limited amount of computation that we have to be able to solve all of the different problems that we're going to have to face. We're going to have to be extremely efficient in the way that we deploy our computational resources. And finally, humans have limited communication, right? So it's simply not the case that I can transfer my brain state directly to you. We have to rely on these, unfortunately, low bandwidth media, like me making weird honking noises with my mouth. That is the best way that we have for me to get information from my brain to your brain. And that's characteristic of what it is to be a human being. And it's not characteristic of the situation that we imagine, our machines being in, right? So if I told you I got a fancy new computer, and that fancy new computer doesn't have Wi-Fi, it doesn't have any of these other resources, all that it can do is make honking noises, and then that's how it's going to communicate with other computers, you would not think that was a very fancy computer, right? So we're used to the idea that machines are able to copy both their internal state in terms of their current state of computation, but also the data that they've had available to them that's got them to that state and transfer that to another machine. And so these limitations are characteristic of human computational problems, but I think they're arguably not characteristic of the way that people have been approaching computational problems in the contemporary sort of approaches to machine learning and artificial intelligence. So this is a nice illustration of this. This comes from a blog post that was put out by OpenAI, where they looked at a series of kind of recent breakthroughs in machine learning and artificial intelligence, and looked at, as a function of time, how much computation was going into each of those, right? And in this case, computation is also confounded with data, right? Because the computation is not just making bigger models, but also making models that are trained on more data that's generated in various ways. And so the key thing, right, if you look at this graph, the first thing you notice is that this line goes up. So as we go from sort of AlexNet to AlphaGo, this line rises. But the second thing you notice, if you look on the vertical axis here, is that this is on a logarithmic scale. So what this corresponds to is an exponential increase in the amount of computation which is being used. I think it's roughly doubling every 3 months, sort of far faster than Moore's law. That's the amount of computation that we have doubles about every 18 months. So there's this very rapid doubling in the amount of computational resources that are being dedicated to solving these problems. And so this represents a very different paradigm, right? It's not one where these machines have limited time because they can be trained on more and more data. It's not that they have limited computation because more and more computational resources are being recruited. And it's not the case that they have limited communication because they're capable of, you can copy that same information across multiple machines and use that to sort of parallelize these computations directly. And so what I would argue is that the structure of these human computational problems leads to a characteristic kind of intelligence that's what we associate with human minds and what we try and explain in cognitive science. And that, in fact, the kinds of math that we might need to use to understand these human capacities might be somewhat different from the kinds of math that we need to use in order to, make that line go up, right? In order to do a better job of building effective AI systems that are capable of solving problems that are like the problems that humans face, but different in the kinds of limitations that they operate under. And so what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is kind of just go through these 3 kinds of limitations and then talk about their implications for the kind of math that we might need to use for understanding human minds. And again, I'm going to be arguing that I think there are certain kinds of mathematics that are relevant for understanding human cognition that may, I think are useful in the context of artificial intelligence, but are sort of distinctively useful in the context of understanding the mission of cognitive scientists of understanding human minds. So the first of these limitations is limited time. And really what limited time means is limited data. So if you don't have a lot of time, that means that you don't have many opportunities to experience data that you can use to then inform the actions that you take in the future. There are a few ways that limited time manifests in human lives, a few different timescales that human beings have to operate on. The simplest of these is a timescale of survival, right? So you need to be able to recognize pretty quickly that this is a bad situation and one you should avoid. You need to be able to learn from, relatively few examples that when you encounter situations like this, they're not something that you want to be in. And so if you want to sort of be a successful biological organism, you need to operate at a timescale which is set by the world around you, right? And that world has other biological organisms that are operating at a particular timescale. That means that you need to be able to pretty rapidly learn certain kinds of things. And so this is one sense in which we need to be able to learn from limited data, is just in order to be able to survive, we need to be able to learn from few instances of things that are, particularly, important to us, whether it's bad things or good things. Another uniquely human timescale is the timescale of childhood, right? So I sort of talked about human lifespans as a constraint on the amount of data that we get. But in fact, if you think about that, there's a subset of that lifespan, which is the most important constraint on the data that we get. Because if you spent your entire life learning how to do something, then you would only be good at it at the end of that life, right? And so you wouldn't have many opportunities to benefit from the knowledge that you'd acquired. And so really, when we think about the timescale that's imposed by having a limited lifetime, there's also this sort of sub-timescale of something like childhood, which is the period in which you need to learn things in order to be able to benefit from them. Or in the language of computer science reinforcement learning, this explore exploit trade-off, right? Which is that you want to spend some amount of your time exploring in order to be able to then exploit the knowledge that you've acquired through that process of exploration. And I've argued with Alison Gopnik that this kind of perspective actually can be used to understand a lot about the nature of human childhood. So, for example, babies are notoriously bad at making decisions. They do all sorts of terrible things. They put things in their mouth that they shouldn't. They, act pretty randomly. But in fact, that makes a lot of sense from this kind of explore exploit perspective, where babies are in the exploration phase of their lifetime, and they should be spending that period trying all of the things in order to figure out which things are good. It might turn out that power sockets taste like chocolate, in which case, you've made an important discovery that you can exploit for the rest of your life. So this is the second timescale we have to deal with, which is this timescale of childhood and making this transition from exploration to exploitation. And I'd say, again, there's a natural sort of structure to human lives, which reflects the fact that we have this finite horizon that we're operating over. And then finally, the last sort of fundamental timescale of human cognition is the one that's imposed by the fact that, yeah, we do have a limit on the total amount of data that we can learn from. And this means that if a human is going to learn how to do something, it needs to be something that you can learn how to do in about 80 years, right? That's kind of like the upper limit on the kinds of things that are humanly achievable is imposed by our ability to learn those things. And so, again, when we look at the kind of breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, we see those kinds of systems doing things that require amounts of training that exceed, and in some cases massively exceed, the amount of data that a human being can experience. And that's going to be a clue that the way in which they're sort of learning to do that is somewhat different from the way in which a human being is learning to do that. And so these are things that help us to think about, okay, maybe there's a difference in the approaches that are being taken here that is going to limit the amount that we're able to learn about human cognition by looking at the kinds of strategies that are used for learning in those contexts. But again, that's a point that I'm going to return to in a moment. And so here, this is just an example of AlphaGo, right, with many human lifetimes of experience, playing Lisa doll with only part of one human lifetime of experience. And again, there are multiple examples like this. Large language models are another example with the equivalent of many thousands of years of continuous speech, whereas a 5-year-old acquires a good understanding of English from just 5 years of exposure. Okay, so in some ways, I think you can kind of think about this difference as a difference in the way that we think about data in machine learning and cognitive science. So from a machine learning perspective, when we think about learning from limited data, really the question that you're asking is something like, how much data do I need in order to achieve the desired performance from my system? And so it's really about being able to make the best use of the data that's available and thinking about how to get more data if you need to get more data. And so a lot of the emphasis in machine learning recently has been on scalable, flexible algorithms, where the goal is to be able to accommodate as much data as possible, rather than on engineering the inductive bias of those algorithms in a way that then makes them sort of more aligned with the structure of the problems that's being solved and reduces the amount of data that they need. I think there's been a kind of general perspective and what some people like Rich Sutton have called it a bitter lesson, that effort that's gone into engineering inductive bias has kind of been overtaken by the availability of more and more computation in a way that in fact if you just sort of wait for a little bit longer, the inductive bias that you so painfully engineered is something which will then, not be necessary because it's going to get beaten by a system that's more flexible but able to process more data. And you can contrast this with the case of cognitive science, where really the question that we're trying to answer is a question which is something like, how is it that adult human performance results from the available data? So now data is not a fungible quantity, data is a fixed quantity. And we want to explain how you get to the endpoint that we want to understand from the fixed amount of data which is available to you. And so the only kind of element of flexibility that we have there in explaining that is this element of inductive bias, right? So you can think about it, the machine learning version is a small amount of inductive bias, scale the amount of data you have. The cognitive science version is small amount of data, scale the inductive biases that you have. And so that puts a particular emphasis on being able to identify human inductive biases and formalize those inductive biases. That's particularly important for the kind of project that we do in cognitive science. So to return to my kind of question of what kind of math you want to use for trying to do that, I think one of the sort of standard tools that we have in our toolkit for thinking about inductive bias is something like Bayesian inference, right? So Bayes' rule has built into it the notion of inductive bias. So it tells us how we go from the prior beliefs we have about a hypothesis to the posterior beliefs we have about a hypothesis after we see data. It tells us we do that by taking our prior probability distribution, multiplying it by a likelihood that reflects how probable it is to see those data if that hypothesis were true. But if you sort of think about this, there's this term here, this prior probability distribution that has nothing to do with data, that has just as big an impact on the conclusions that you reach as the data itself. And so this gives us a tool that we can use for identifying what kind of inductive bias leads to what kind of conclusion in a way that we can use to diagnose aspects of human inductive biases empirically. So this approach does have a connection to sorts of strategies that are being used in contemporary machine learning. In particular, it's closely related to methods for what's called metalearning. So metalearning, the way that this problem is formulated in machine learning is you have a system which is going to learn to perform many different tasks. Those tasks are drawn from some common distribution. What you want to be able to do is extract the information about what the structure is that those tasks have in common. And one way to do that, so a popular meta-learning algorithm is something called MAML for model agnostic meta-learning. And the way that that works is you basically learn a common initialization across all of those tasks. So if you're going to be training neural networks to solve all of those tasks separately, what you do is you sort of train all of those neural networks from a common set of initial weights. And then you have both an inner loop of learning, where you're learning to perform the task, and an outer loop where you're improving those initial weights. So you're sort of back propagating through the learning process itself to try and train the initialization to the point where that initialization becomes a good initialization for solving all of the tasks you're trying to solve. And so that procedure is a way of instantiating inductive bias into the neural network models, right? The choice of initialization is a form of inductive bias. And in fact, you can show this paper with Aaron Grant, one of my students at Berkeley. We showed that this MAML procedure actually has a very close relationship to hierarchical Bayesian methods for identifying prior distributions from data, and in fact is equivalent for some models, in particular for linear models. And so this kind of meta-learning approach is a way of doing kind of learning the prior, which we're going to use when we're solving particular kinds of problems. So I mentioned that this is something which then is going to help us to understand a little bit about sort of contemporary machine learning methods and to give us a different perspective on how we can think about those engaging with human learning. And so in a paper with Tom McCoy and Aaron, Paul Smolensky, and Tal Linzen, we actually proposed that this kind of meta-learning procedure is actually something that you can use for identifying effective inductive biases in contexts like language learning. And so the basic idea is that if you think about the problem of trying to characterize the inductive bias that you need to solve human language learning problems, one way you can think about that is that the languages themselves correspond to the different tasks that are drawn from this underlying distribution. And then what we want to do is to find parameters for our learning algorithm, which are going to sort of correspond to a good initialization for learning all of these different languages. And so in this paper, we look at this for certain kinds of phonological language learning problems. But the idea is that what we do is you take a bunch of neural network models, you use this meta-learning procedure to figure out the inductive bias that they need in order to be able to capture that. And then you go in and then analyze the properties of those models in order to recover the sort of qualitative properties of the inductive bias, the sort of prior distribution that you need in order to do a good job of solving these language learning problems. And in many ways, I think that this gives us a perspective that we can use for understanding some of the correspondence between these sort of machine learning methods that are trained on very large amounts of data and the human learning case, where if we think about the human learning case as what takes us from this initialization to the endpoint of knowing a language here, then the generic version of the machine learning problem is you start at whatever random initialization you start at, and then you sort of go all the way to learning the structure of that language. Whereas the human version, this sort of outer loop of learning that gets you to this initialization point is what's been satisfied by an evolutionary process. And so you can kind of think about these massive language learning problems as something where there's a component of learning which is this sort of component of this optimization problem of getting you to the point where you've done a good job of learning this language, which recapitulates the process of evolution in the human case, and then a component which is the learning component, and using methods like meta-learning, where we think not just about learning a single language, but about what's the kind of inductive bias that you need for learning multiple languages. That's a kind of tool that we can use to decompose that long trajectory and that huge amount of data which is needed for training those systems into a part that maybe gives us a picture of what evolved inductive bias might be like, and then a part that corresponds to what learning you need to do to get from that inductive bias to the final endpoint. And so I think this is a promising tool in general for helping to reconcile these kind of massive machine learning models with some aspect of human learning. So the second of these fundamental limitations is that we have limited amounts of computation that we're able to deploy. And you can see this by just sort of looking at the structure of human solutions to computational problems. So this is an example of a case where we have both humans and sort of computer algorithms solving the same problem, which is solving a Rubik's Cube. So it turns out that if you have enough computers, you can actually work out the shortest path from any Rubik's Cube state to the solved state. And the shortest paths have a maximum length of 20 moves. So, if you sort of compute these shortest paths, you can show that you can get from any state of the Rubik's Cube to a solution in 20 moves or less. If you give a human expert a Rubik's Cube and they solve it for you as quickly as they can, it's probably going to take more like 40 to 50 moves. So human beings use algorithms for solving these problems, which are able to solve the problem, but are significantly less efficient in terms of the number of moves than this sort of optimal solution. However, those human solutions are much more efficient than the solution which is computed by finding the shortest path, in that you can actually write them down on sort of less than a page of paper, right? So you can sort of write down a page of paper, all of the information that you need in order to be able to solve the Rubik's Cube using the strategies that are used by expert solvers, whereas writing down the information about what these shortest paths are requires a massive database, right? It's sort of a huge amount of information that's stored in this giant lookup table. And so the human solution here is, I think we could characterize it as, it's sort of representationally more efficient. It's something which a human being can execute, where it has a sort of structure, where it has things like goals and sub-goals, like finish one side, and then sort of work on the next side, and so on and so on, that make sense to a human being, sort of recognizable intermediate states, things that allow us to use the resources that we have efficiently to solve these problems. And discovering something which is sort of representationally efficient in this way, that corresponds to the kinds of strategies that an intelligent agent can use, that doesn't require the resources of solving this giant sort of shortest path problem, is something that human minds excel at, and something that we still don't have good sort of machine solutions for. And so in order to understand how it is that people are able to be efficient in this kind of way, to take a problem, to break it down into components and be able to then sort of work out what computational resources they should be deploying, we actually need a different kind of theory of sort of optimization problem that we're solving. And so in my lab, we've been working a lot on sort of rethinking what the structure of these human optimization problems look like, and in particular, rethinking what rational decision-making might look like. So the sort of classic version of rational decision-making is expected utility theory, where we focus on taking the action that has the highest expected utility, right? So here the idea is that we think about decision-making in terms of a maximization problem over actions where we're trying to find the action that results in the highest expected utility. And so if we reduce this to a slogan, the slogan is something like, do the right thing. And so one problem with this classic kind of view of decision-making is that it says nothing about the amount of computation that you need to do in order to solve this problem, right? So, if we apply it in the context of our Rubik's Cube problem, right, it's just saying like, okay, find the solution. It doesn't matter how much work you have to do in order to compute what that solution is. And so this is very clearly not what people do when we're making decisions. We're operating under, fundamental constraints about the amount of computation that we can do, and often constraints about, the amount of time that we have for solving a problem. And it turns out that, people in artificial intelligence have recognized this, and that AI systems are also operating under similar sorts of time constraints and so on. They have finite amounts of computation. And so as a consequence, they've developed a kind of class of theories of rational action, which take this into account. And these go by a variety of different names: bounded optimality, computational rationality, meta-level rationality. I'm going to talk about resource rationality, which is what we call this in the context of sort of cognitive problems, which makes it clear that it's really about the rational allocation of limited cognitive resources. So from this perspective, the problem that we're trying to solve is actually a problem of not just sort of trying to choose a good action in the world, but trying to choose a good internal sequence of computations to get us to the point where we end up taking something that ends up being a good action. And so the way that we formalize this is to actually have our maximization here be over strategies or policies or algorithms, the procedures that we're going to follow that are going to end up yielding the beliefs that we're going to use to take the action in the world. And so the idea here is that we're going to engage in some sequence of internal computations, C. Those computations are going to be, somewhat costly. There's a cost which is associated with executing each computation. As a consequence of executing those computations, it's going to lead us to have some beliefs. And then we take a reasonable action, the rational action based on the beliefs that we have. But we're trading off the payoff that comes from that action with the computational cost of getting to the point where we've worked out what that action is. And so if we express this as a slogan, the slogan is something like, do the right thinking, right? One of the reasons why this is appealing is that if you think about this kind of classic theory of rationality, it's really a behaviorist notion of rationality. It just says, put all of the emphasis on the external world and the action you take in the external world. Whereas resource rationality puts the emphasis on the internal cognitive states. And if you're a cognitive scientist or cognitive psychologist, you're interested in not just what actions people take in the external world, but what cognitive processes they engage in order to decide what actions make sense. And so this is, in many ways, a better notion of rational action from the perspective of cognitive science, where we want to understand not just the external action, but the sequence of computations that were involved in getting there. So if I reduce this to a cartoon, it looks something like this. Here's our, sort of classical behaviorist sort of theory of rational action. Here's resource rationality, where now we're putting the emphasis on not this external action, but the sequence of computations we perform in order to get to the point where we're ready to act. So one consequence of doing this is that we can now ask questions like, well, what sequence of cognitive operations should I execute in order to take an action in the world? And we can actually work out what the optimal strategies are for solving different kinds of cognitive problems. And so the key insight here is that the problem of choosing a cognitive strategy to follow is something we can describe as a sequential decision problem where the computations are actions. And by this, what I mean is you can think about this as, if I am going to be taking an action in the world, the first thing I ask myself is, okay, what's the first computation I'm going to perform? I get some information back. I'm like, okay, do I have enough information to take the action in the world yet? Maybe not. I need to do some more thinking. Okay, what's the next computation I'm going to perform? You get some information back and you say, okay, now do I know enough? Maybe not. Okay, let's do one more computation. Okay, now I think I've got enough information to act, and you take the action. So what we have is a sequence of decisions about the next computation to execute. But once it's formulated in those terms as a sequence of decisions about computational actions to take, we can recognize that this is a structure, which is a familiar structure from looking at aspects of human decision-making. It's something that's called a Markov decision process. And so we can describe this using what we call a meta-level Markov decision process, because it's not a decision. Normally, these models are used for describing sequences of actions that we take in the external world. And here we're talking about a sequence of actions that we take in the internal world, the sequence of computations that we're going to be executing to solve a problem. But we can derive optimal sequences of cognitive processes as a consequence of solving these kinds of meta-level Markov decision processes. And so just to sort of explain this a little more, this is a Markov decision process. The way that it's normally formulated, we imagine that the world is in some state. As a consequence of being in that state, there are some actions that you can take. Depending on the action that you take, you receive some reward. And then with some probability, you're going to transition to a new state. And then from that state, you can take an action, get a reward, go to the next state, and so on. And at every point, the consequence of the actions you take depend only on the current state. And so that's why it's called a Markov decision process, because you have this kind of pattern of independence from previous states of the world. And so these kinds of Markov decision processes are widely used in the study of reinforcement learning and human decision-making. And as a consequence, there's a nice extensive psychological literature on these kinds of models. What we're doing is extending that idea now to thinking about cognitive processes in what's called a meta-level Markov decision process. So now the states of the system become the beliefs of the agent. Instead of the actions being in the external world, they become computations that we execute internally. And then we're going to receive rewards that are basically, to start out with, the computational cost of taking these sort of computations. That then we transition to a new belief state, and so on and so on. And then at some point, there's a special action that we execute, which is the one that says, I am done thinking. And then I take an action based on my current beliefs. And then that action yields some reward based on the external world. And so this is a framework that we've been doing a lot of work in with Falk Leader, Fred Calloway, current student here at Princeton, and Paul Kruger, another student here at Princeton, in looking at how we can explain a whole bunch of aspects of human decision-making and cognition from this kind of perspective. It gives us a new kind of tool for thinking about what optimal cognitive processes might look like. I'm just going to show you one example of this, which comes from the domain of planning. So in this case, we just look at a simple kind of planning problem where you're trying to navigate an agent, in this case, it's a little spider, through a system where you have to sort of make a sequence of decisions about what you're going to do. So at each point, when you sort of follow a path, the reward that you get is the sum of the values that appear along that path. So if we go here, we pay a cost of -5, then we get a reward of 10, and then we get a reward of 5. And so the total amount of reward we'd get from getting to this endpoint is 10 points. And so the challenge that people have in this planning problem is just finding the best path through this space. And you can think about this as analogous to planning problems that show up in the context of games like chess or other kinds of things where you need to sort of consider future states and then find the state which results in the best outcome. The twist and the kind of requirement for computational actions here is that information is not available to you. So in order to reveal the label on a particular state, the reward that's associated with transitioning through that state, you need to click on that state. So this is a version of the classic mouse lab task that's been used to study decision making, but we've translated this now to this sequential decision setting. And so the question is, what information do you need to gather? What sort of computations do you need to execute in order to give you the information that you need to find an effective path through this graph? And we can again formulate this in terms of meta-level Markov decision processes, right? So now our belief states correspond to the beliefs that we have about the values associated with each of those nodes. We have actions which allow us to evaluate the content of those nodes, and then there's some cost which is associated with those actions. And at the end of the day, we're going to choose a path, and then we get a reward that corresponds to the payoff that's associated with going along that particular path. And so we can actually, from this meta-level Markov decision process, then derive what the optimal strategy looks like. And we can compare that optimal strategy to the kinds of algorithms that are typically used in computer science for solving these sorts of planning problems. And what we find when we do that is that this sort of optimal cognitive strategy does a better job of explaining human behavior than any of the kind of algorithms that have been proposed either in computer science or in cognitive science for capturing these kinds of planning processes. And the reason for this is that humans demonstrate a kind of efficiency in the use of cognitive resources that none of these algorithms incorporate. And you can see this by just sort of looking at this graph. So what I'm showing here is on the horizontal axis, the number of clicks that's been made so far, so the amount of information people have gathered. On the vertical axis, the best expected path value that's been recovered based on the clicks that have been made. And then the color here indicates the probability that people stop searching at that point. So when you get to yellow, that's 100%, dark blue is not at all. And what you should notice is that this color gradient, as we go from the bottom left corner to the top right corner, this color gradient shifts, right, from dark blue up to yellow. So there's this kind of diagonal here. What that diagonal reflects is that people are intelligently trading off the number of sort of opportunities they have to gather more information with the best path that they've found so far. So they're doing a kind of satisficing, right, where they're kind of saying, okay, you know what, I found a pretty good value already. I've only got a couple more clicks left. Doesn't seem worth gathering more information. I'm gonna just go on and take an action at that point. And so this is demonstrating a kind of adaptivity that we see in our optimal solution, but you don't see in classic kinds of planning algorithms that are, you know, used in computer science, because, you know, it's sort of a level of consideration of deploying these resources, which is not something which is usually anticipated. So this kind of approach of thinking about whether it makes sense to deploy cognitive resources and what cognitive resources it makes sense to deploy is something that can be applied to problems in artificial intelligence as well. And this kind of meta level decision problem shows up in some unexpected places. So here's an example, which is learning the structure of a deep neural network. And this is joint work with, so that's led by Michael Chang. He's a graduate student at Berkeley. So you can think about the problem of kind of designing the architecture of a deep neural network in terms of if you have a set of layers, right, that you could choose to deploy. So each of those layers instantiates some implicit function that takes the input to that layer and transforms it to an output. The problem of sort of deciding what neural network to use to solve a problem, you can formulate as the sequential decision problem where you say, I've got my input. Based on that input, I'm going to apply this layer of the neural network. And then based on the output of that, I'm going to apply this layer of a neural network. And based on the output of that, I'm going to apply this layer of a neural network. So you can kind of think about it as what we're doing is constructing a path through a sequence of options where at each point we could choose what transformation we want to apply to our input. And so the result is going to be an algorithm that's adaptively choosing the structure of a network in order to solve a particular problem that it faces, trying to figure out how to deploy the computational resource that it has in terms of these different functions for solving a particular problem. And so we've used this approach to show that you can build neural networks that actually learn to do a kind of combinatorial generalization. So in this case, this is a network which learns how to translate from between a pair of languages that it's never seen before as a consequence of having experience with translating between other pairs of languages. And so what it's able to do is kind of like chain together the information that it has about how you translate from one language to another to allow it to build a solution that allows it to then translate between two languages that it hasn't seen before. You can also use the same kind of approach to do things like learning invariances for a neural network system. So in this case, what we do is take a particular neural network, an image classifier, we fix that as the sort of final system that information is going to go through and produce an output. And then the task of the rest of the system is to sort of figure out how to transform the input appropriately in order to present it to that classifier in the way that results in the best performance. And so then that system learns to appropriately combine together different transformations that it can do to the input. So for example, here's an input. It's an 8 that's sort of on its side. So it applies a transformation that centers it and then applies a transformation that makes it straight, and then it passes it on to the classifier. Here's another example of like a 4, right, which needs to be rotated. So it sort of gradually implements this rotation and then passes that off to the classifier. So the system is kind of learning to tailor the input that it needs in order to make a decision by applying a sequence of transformations, and it's making intelligent decisions about what transformations to apply in order to get there. And so I think this is sort of just starting to scratch the surface of thinking about how you can build AI systems that intelligently use their computation in this kind of way. Okay, so the last topic I'm going to talk about is this limitation on communication. And when I showed you this picture, there's something that's perhaps a little misleading about it, which is it's not the case that the amount of compute that's being used by these machines is located on a single machine, and we're just sort of building single machines that are more and more powerful, and that's what's allowing us to do this. It's actually that over this period there have been various kind of developments in the way that we can appropriately parallelize the computations that go into these kinds of AI systems, that then make it possible to recruit more and more machines, and as a consequence, get more and more computational power. And so that kind of parallelization is a part of how computers overcome their resource limitations, constraints on time and on amount of compute. And in many ways, that provides some inspiration for thinking about how it is that human minds can solve those problems. So you can think about humans as engaging in the same kind of distributed computation for getting around our own constraints. If you are trying to solve a problem that requires more computation than a single mind can provide, then we do things like work together, we form companies, we sort of collaborate, we pool our cognitive resources in order to solve those problems. And if you have problems which require more data than you can accumulate in a single lifetime, we have the benefit of processes of cumulative cultural evolution. So, for example, the human Go players are not in a situation where they have to learn the entire game from scratch just by playing the game. They also have the benefit of teachers who've condensed information about the game into a format that makes it easier for them to make progress, and books that have been written, and sort of many thousands of years of cumulative information which has been acquired by humans experiencing this and then writing down the consequences of it, which is allowing them to then sort of benefit from that process of accumulation of knowledge. And so both of these processes of collaboration and of cumulative cultural evolution are things that are facilitated by mechanisms for sharing mental states, such as teaching and language. And so a lot of the primacy of things like teaching and language and what we think about as sort of characteristics of human intelligence is that they are the way that human beings deal with this kind of problem of trying to be able to parallelize, to do distributed computation in this kind of way. And so I think there's another kind of math that we need to use for thinking about how to make sense of these kinds of processes. And that's sort of math that comes from looking at parallel algorithms and distributed computation in general. And so the way that we try and answer these kinds of questions about how societies accumulate data is through things like parallel algorithms for inference, or questions about how societies accumulate innovations can come through parallel algorithms for optimization. And so again, we've done a bunch of work in my lab that sort of takes this perspective. For example, looking at classic algorithms for parallelizing probabilistic inference as analogs for certain kinds of cultural processes. For example, the particle filter, which is a tool for doing Bayesian inference, where instead of representing a posterior distribution by an entire distribution, you represent it by a set of samples. It says, take some samples from the distribution based on all of your previous experience, weight those samples based on how well they explain a new piece of data that you observe, and then resample from that distribution. And in order to then produce your sort of next set of samples, you can think about this as an actual analog for certain kinds of processes of cultural transmission, right? Where it's sort of saying, if you think about this as being something like science, it's like, you've got a set of hypotheses, and then, people do some more experiments, and sort of, based on those experiments, some of those hypotheses are supported and some of them aren't. And then the next generation of scientists are going to be more concentrated around those hypotheses that receive more support from, that generation of experimental results, right? And so this way of formalizing processes of cultural transmission is actually something that generates, interesting hypotheses about the kinds of things that we can go and look for in actual processes of cultural transmission generated by humans. And so this is just showing you some results from a recent study by Bill Thompson and Bas van Ophusen in my lab, where we've actually put people in a situation where they need to figure out some complex algorithms. They're actually figuring out sorting algorithms in this case from scratch. And we can look at what algorithms get transmitted, and we can look at what are the sort of dynamics of this process and actually formalize them in this kind of way. Okay, so these three kinds of limitations, limited time, limited computation, and limited communication, really, I think, translate into certain kinds of math that are particularly important for understanding human minds. Right, so I've sort of highlighted Bayesian inference and meta-learning, meta-level rationality or resource rationality, meta-level MDPs, parallel algorithms, things like particle filters, as things that I think are particularly useful for trying to think about these kinds of problems that come up in human cognition. I think there's also a parallel set of implications for artificial intelligence, right? So the first is that we shouldn't expect the intelligence produced by machines to look like that of people, unless they're solving the same kind of problems, right? So generically, AI systems aren't subject to the same kinds of constraints as human minds, but you can come up with scenarios where those AI systems are trying to solve problems that are analogous to the ones that people face. So if you think about a human being is an example of a autonomous, low compute, low bandwidth intelligent system. And you can come up with examples of things that are kind of like this, like stuff that has to run on a mobile phone is sort of somewhat in this space, right? If you have an intelligent system that has to run entirely on a mobile phone and that doesn't have a high capacity for communication, if you're building like interstellar probes that need to go out into the universe and gather information about the nature of the universe, you can come up with scenarios that are sort of like this sort of human version of the problem. But I think, in general, that doesn't mean that we can't learn from humans, right? I would say that things like rapid learning, efficient compute, and using things like language and teaching, they're all things that it would be nice for our AI systems to have. But the reason why I'm arguing that, for cognitive science, these kinds of things that I've been focused on are particularly important is that there's a fundamental difference, which is that humans need to have them. So if we want to make progress in understanding the human case, then we really need to focus on understanding these aspects of learning, which are not a necessary component of any kind of AI system. Okay, so conclusions. Human computational problems really reflect three human limitations, potentially different from AI: limited time, computation, and communication. Studying these limitations uses three formalisms that are distinctly relevant to cognitive science, right? So Bayes, resource rationality, and parallel algorithms are the things that I've focused on. But I think at the highest level, really, changing the reference class here changes perhaps how we're going to characterize what it is that's unique about humans. So, in some ways, the constraints that I've been emphasizing are really things that are consequences of being a biological intelligence rather than a machine intelligence. And so if we want to try and characterize what it is that makes human beings unique, maybe it's okay to go back to Aristotle's answer and just change the emphasis, which is that humans are animals that think. Thank you.